Welcome back to Newsday. We still have with us research analyst at the Center for Democracy and Development, Afolabi Adekaiyaoja. And also joining us is the Executive Director of Yaga Africa, Samson Itodo. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Afolabi, thank you so much for staying with us. Now, I'm going to go to Samson. I would like to have your impression of the final report by EU observers on Nigeria's general election.
Well, thanks for having me. The EU Observer reports on the 2023 general elections contains findings that are valid and consistent with the observation of citizens groups as well as majority of Nigerians. It highlights the critical issues that bedevil our electoral process. One of them deals with, the lack of trust and confidence on the Electoral Commission, and in this case, INEC, as well as some procedural shortcomings that cast a shadow of doubt on credibility, or shadow of doubt on the credibility of the 2023 elections. But it also looks at other aspects of our electoral process, about the rights of citizens to cast their votes. It looks at the 2022 Electoral Act that underwent its first test in the 2023 elections. And from the report, we can clearly see that the 2022 Electoral Act contains some complexities, some inadequacies that needs to be addressed as we build towards future elections. So the EU observation report, I'd say, it's a reflection of the conclusion of both civil society organizations as well as citizens. And we welcome this report as Yaga Africa as well as other civil society organizations, and do hope that the Nigerian state and all the institutions that have been referenced will take action on the key recommendations contained in the report.
And some of those key recommendations, let me actually move over to Afolabi. Thank you for that, Samson. But Afolabi, if you're still with us, some of those key observations in the report included ambiguities within our laws. There were also issues with the selection process for INEC officials and other electoral staff, and also BVAS. Of course, BVAS, the real-time uploading of results, that was another issue, and the publication of those election results. All of these issues, we have 4 years to look and address them. What are your opinions on the changes that could be seen within this 4 years? Do you think that we can do it, or will it just be more of the same, a rushed job just a couple of months before the next elections?
So, interestingly, we don't have 4 years before the next election. We actually have a couple of months because,
Right.
Imo, Bayelsa, and Kogi go to the polls to elect governors in November. Because of the nature of off-cycle elections, every year we have a new governorship election. So it's really one of those situations where we need to really take a very quick step at understanding the lessons that we've learned from the election process and then actively try to address them. Obviously, there are some concerns about how fast and how active an administration is going to be in really taking these lessons on board. We all remember how the previous administration refused to give assent to the electoral bill that had been proposed by the last National Assembly, and it only did so when it was no longer going to be an active participant during the recently concluded elections. So it's about trying to make sure that as much as possible, all the different stakeholders are actively engaged and actively trying to push and make sure that these lessons are learned as quickly as possible. Now, some of the points that you already mentioned that the EU report actually touches on are things that we definitely do agree with, from CDD, and think that things that need to be actively corrected. Like, for example, you touched on IREV, which is the INEC result viewing portal, where till today, not all the results from the elections have actually been uploaded. And that ties into some of the ambiguities around the law. For example, the INEC can actually use the BVAS and IRF to upload the result, but it's not bound to collate it through the particular system itself. It's about making sure that many of these different, loopholes or different areas are actually much more reviewed, and to make sure that we don't have a situation where it's an if or but, but it's a very clear, very written, and very, very easy to understand procedure that is going forward. And ultimately, what this report should really start off is a really long conversation that many different groups have to get involved in. The stakeholders that are involved in Nigeria's elections are many. And it's not just INEC, it's not just the government, even citizens, even just everyone who is involved and who knows is actually a stakeholder in ensuring that our election process is much more robust and much more independent and much more fair.
Now, Samson, INEC has said that it is unfair, to judge the Commission for results upload glitch experienced during the February presidential poll, and that is not enough reason to write off the entire polls held nationwide. Now, some analysts believe that this suggests a lack of accountability on the part of INEC, and that this might affect future elections. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, INEC is an umpire. It should leave citizens to judge based on the parameters set first in our Electoral Act and our Constitution, including INEC's guidelines, as well as a timetable for elections. So when we judge the credibility or the transparency or integrity of elections, we look at this cumulatively. And so it's not in INEC's place to tell us how to assess the commission. There are standard ways of assessing the Electoral Commission. We note that, yes, the beavers functioned when it came to accreditation. But when it came to the transmission of results, there were, issues with that process. And INEC needs to accept that it failed in delivering on its promise. When you on the IREF, as it relates to presidential elections. If you look at election logistics, the Commission told Nigerians they were fully prepared. Yes, for the first time in our electoral history, sensitive materials were produced locally, both ballot papers, result sheets. And so how come that in some regions, in some geopolitical zones, polling units opened very late? So there were logistical challenges, and this feeds into the overall assessment of the election. So when we look at this election and say, yes, INEC requires fundamental reforms, and INEC, did fail in certain regard, these are the issues that we look when we assess the elections. If you look at the conduct of INEC officials themselves, there are reports, of first both permanent and ad hoc officials who undermine the integrity of the process. Adamawa is a case in point. Even INEC took remedial actions in Sokoto, in Abia, but you can see that to a large extent, the Commission didn't deliver on its promise. And what INEC should do now, since it commenced its own review process, is to accept responsibility for issues that are within their control that they didn't address. We note that there are exogenous factors that impact on INEC's functionality, things like the security agencies, like its vendors, or even the state. We note that. But when we measure INEC's performance, we do so mindful of the constitutional powers and the limits of INEC's responsibility. And in that regard, we have said, and just like the EU report have also said, that whilst INEC introduced reforms to enhance the integrity of the process, whilst this election is the most meticulously planned election since 1999, this particular election does not meet the test, be it the credibility test, be it the test as to the responsiveness of the Electoral Commission. And I'd say that Nigerians are not unfair when they make these demands of INEC, because we can't continue to reduce or lower the standards that we hold our electoral or democratic institutions to account. INEC performed creditably well in some areas, but in some areas it didn't. And our interest is to ensure that it takes responsibility for the lack of confidence that citizens currently have on the electoral process, and then explain to Nigerians and say these are practical steps we are taking to address this, especially those that are within the powers of INEC. So if you take the appointment of commissioners into INEC, it's not INEC's responsibility. It's the president that appoints, subject to confirmation of the Senate. Now, you had a situation, and one of the retrogressive legacies of President Buhari is appointing people who are politically aligned, people who have tainted records into INEC. And that itself impeded on INEC's ability to organize and conduct credible elections. And I hope that the current president, as he looks forward to his administration, is to take steps to protect the independence of INEC, because as it stands, the majority of Nigerians do not have confidence in the Electoral Commission, and this does not spell well for our democracy.
Thank you for that. All right, Afolabi, let me come to you still on the subject of credibility. Just recently, a few prominent Nigerians, including SAN, Olisa Bakoba, have called for the removal of the chairman of INEC, Mahmood Yakubu. Is that too drastic of a step? What do you think? So
ultimately, whether it's now, or whether when his term finishes, the ultimate challenge isn't about the person who is the chair. The ultimate challenge is about the ability of the institution itself to actually thrive and to actually fulfill and deliver on the mandate that it has to Nigerians. So there's no point of even replacing the chair if the next person, whoever it is, however credible, however strong, however solid it is, comes in to meet a same institution that is still going to go through the exact same issues. We still have the challenges of commissioners who may or may not be amenable to the particular direction that INEC chair has. INEC itself has a lot of responsibilities in the entire election process, but then some that it is just quite frankly unable to actually meet. You're looking at issues of campaign finance, for example. Effective campaign finance regulation is something that is still not as present or not as potent in Nigeria's election cycle, despite the fact that we have an electoral act that just got passed, and then we still have quite a very long election campaign cycle. You're also looking at even the ability for INEC to effectively try and follow up with sanctioning for offenders of electoral activities. So ultimately, there's no difference if you appoint somebody else who comes in, if you move the chair now. The work that needs to be done is to ensure that the institution itself is so strong, so independent, and also so effective to the point that whoever it is that becomes chair, the person is not allowed, not able to even corrupt the structure that is there. So what needs to be done right now is what INEC is doing presently, which is to actually follow through with the entire lesson process to effectively make sure that the lessons and the learnings that needed to be done from this election cycle are carried out. At that point, whichever decision that is taken either by the president or by a different administration, that's something that can be followed through at that particular stage. But removing the chair right now, quite frankly, it won't be a difference in terms of whether someone comes in or not, because the institution still stays the same. That is the work that needs to be done to ensure that future elections are much more credible.
Samson, one of the key areas that the EU report touched on was the low participation of women and people with disabilities in the electoral process. Now, I'm wondering how this can be addressed and corrected moving forward, especially even with the off-cycle elections that we'll be holding later this year.
Well, there are three different ways to address this. First, you need to have a legal regime that recognizes the essence and the value of inclusion. The Ninth National Assembly failed to pass the 5 gender bills. And I think the 10th National Assembly, has a duty and a responsibility, and perhaps a golden opportunity to bring back those bills, because those bills border on the rights of women. It borders on protecting their rights as well as their rights to participate in decision making. And so that's the first thing. The second is we need to look at the state, and in this case, the federal government needs to implement, the judgment issued by the court with respect to affirmative action. And if the state enforces that particular judgment, and not what the former Attorney General did by appealing the judgment, I think it will go a long way. The third is the role that the political parties play. Yes, in the last election, parties granted waivers and then reduced cost of nomination forms. But that is tokenistic in every sense of the word. The need to ensure that there's internal democracy in the party, because we know in 2020, in the last election, that even after the primaries where women emerged as winners of those elections, for some of them they were unlawfully substituted, because you have a party system and a structure that does not, prioritizes women participation. And so you look at the National Assembly and see how come we have in 109 Senate only 3 women, only 3 people or 3 senators are women. So political parties have a critical role to play. And lastly is the Nigerian people. And I think that we've got to spend some time, advancing a socialization narrative that helps people appreciate women leadership. Until we as citizens punish political parties for not fielding women candidates, as long as we continue to reward, political parties with our votes when they feature or present more male candidates, this is not going to change. And there are women, who have what it takes, and persons with disability who have what it takes to provide the kind of leadership that Nigerians desire. And it's one leadership that is transparent, that is accountable, and that is responsive. And if you ask me, where will you find those kinds of leaders? You find them within the women population, as well as young people and persons with disability.
Afolabi, with the many cases that ended up going to the election petition tribunal, and of course with the release of this report, does it in any way cast a shadow on the results of our elections?
Yes. Ultimately, whenever there is subsequent post-election litigation, there's still that question of, well, what could have been done better, and does that in any way mar the legitimacy of the elected officials? And ultimately, what it does mean is that it really just shows how important it is that we get it right the first time. The challenge of any different administration when it is now in a position to actually have to defend, or to spend at least the first couple of months when in office defending the fact that it even got there in the first place, is distracting, especially in a country where there are a lot of different challenges that the government needs to hit the ground running on. So what needs to be done, or rather what this just really shows, is how important it is that we actively place a very important premium on how the elections are administered in the first place, to make sure that many of these structures are really put in place well in advance, and that they're actively monitored and enjoyed and actually engaged with to ensure that we have better elections going forward. One other point that the report actually just does touch on that is actually quite important is also looking at the responsibility for the country, especially ensuring that we have better structures in place to address the post-election season. You're looking at the fact that the INEC is now still embroiled in many of these cases that it still has to respond, and that it's also a respondent on. But then INEC still has to do the important duty of now following through with this lessons from this particular election and preparing for the cycle elections in November. It's now time for us to actually start considering how responsibilities INEC has, whether it needs to be reviewed, whether it needs to be changed, or whether even other institutions need to be created to even attend to some of these issues in a much more important and actually in a quicker and faster manner.
Now, Samson, I know that you monitored the just concluded election in Sierra Leone. Now, I'd like you to talk us through the experience and also give us a rather brief, comparative analysis of what went down in Sierra Leone versus what happened in Nigeria's presidential election earlier this year.
By the way, as we try to compare these elections, it's important to note that Sierra Leone has a population of about 7-point-something million and registered voters of just about 3.3 or 3.4 million. And that is just one local government in Lagos State, and perhaps you can say one state in Nigeria. So I think it's important to note that Sierra Leone is a very, very small country. The election was conducted against the background of, yes, harsh economic conditions, a lot of mistrust and polarization. But It was also conducted against a background of lack of trust and confidence in the Electoral Commission of Sierra Leone to manage this process. In the build-up to the election, we saw the opposition parties call for the resignation or sack of the chair of the commission, as well as members of the commission, due to several questions that they raised, on the elections. And I think that their fears, has really come to the fore post the election. What really worked in Sierra Leone? First, let's look at the turnout. According to the Electoral Commission, 83% turnout was recorded. Quite remarkable and unprecedented. If you compare that to Nigeria, where we're still grappling with less than 30% for turnout for national elections, I think there's something to learn from Sierra Leone in that particular regard. So turnout and citizens showing up to conduct their elections. Ethnicity played a critical role in the Sierra Leonean elections, just the same way as a cleavage, it shapes political competition in Nigeria. But when you look at religion, religion compared to Nigeria doesn't play, a frontal role in shaping how politics, is run in Sierra Leone, because they are both Muslim and Christian population. And yes, there's that, whether intermarriage or sort of harmony in living with each other. And so the fact that religion wasn't playing a critical role and shaping how the elections was quite remarkable. If you look at issues around, when you say the things that didn't work, and I think Sierra Leone has a lot to learn from Nigeria. Nigeria has a lot to also learn from Sierra Leone. One of the concerns that stakeholders, international observers and domestic observers have raised was the lack of transparency, in the results management process. Quite frankly, we have our challenges in Nigeria, but our own process it's a bit transparent when it comes to a comparison with Sierra Leone, because it wasn't in any way transparent, especially at the tallying centers. The second issue was election logistics. There were also logistical issues that played out in Sierra Leone, and it sort of manifested the same way it did in Nigeria, because in the last elections, if you look across, the distribution of the opening of polls, based on Yaga Africa's PVT, as at 9:30 a.m. on election day, places like the South and the Southeast were recording very, very low opening of polls for the elections. And some have said that perhaps this is intentional and is deliberate on the part of those who are managing this process. Something similar also played out because in the Western region that was considered, the stronghold of the opposition, there were logistical challenges and polling units didn't open early in those locations. The other issue was around voter identification, and these are really big issues that are shaping elections in Africa. They had issues about voter IDs and who determines who to vote and who should vote. Because you had a situation where the Electoral Commission said, as long as your name was on the voters register, whether you have the voter's card or an ID, you are still going to vote. But there were inconsistencies in the application of that rule. But I think in the final analysis, the Electoral Commission declared the incumbents a winner in that election, having secured, according to the Electoral Commission, 56% of the vote. The organization, a national organization in Sierra Leone, the National Election Watch, with the biggest civil society organization, which conducts the PVT, that like Yaga Africa conducts in Nigeria, came up with its own findings. And it was clear that the results declared by the Electoral Commission was manipulated at the tallying centers. And we have evidence based on news data to believe that the results were manipulated, because according to news data, none of the candidates would have secured 55% of the vote, which is a threshold required by the Constitution for electing a winner. But the Electoral Commission went ahead and announced that the incumbents secured 56% of the votes. And when we looked at the data, it was clear that there were questions and inconsistencies in the number of invalid votes. Because based on the National Elections Watch data, the invalid votes should be somewhere around 4%. But when the Electoral Commission announced its result, it was 0.4%. The reading from that was that in the course of the tallying, they removed they made invalid votes valid in favor of the ruling party, which was what shot his figure to about 56%. So international organizations and as well as domestic organizations have raised questions. We're hoping to see how the Electoral Commission would respond, but the Constitution requires that once a declaration has been made, the president will be sworn into office immediately. And just after the announcement was made, the president was sworn into office. So there's a new president, but there are 7 days for anyone who wants to challenge the outcome of the results. And so we are waiting to see what will be the outcome of this process. But as far as we are concerned, there are sufficient reasons and evidence to believe that the results declared by the Electoral Commission is not a reflection of the ballot cast on Saturday.
Well, all right then. Samson Itodo and, of course, Afolabi Adekaiyaoja, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and having that discussion with us.